There are moments in history when time seems to bend inward on itself, when the ordinary rhythm of years pauses and something else emerges, something quieter but far more deliberate. As if the world were holding its breath before a threshold no one can quite name, but everyone can feel. And 2026 carries that weight. Not because of any single event we can point to with certainty, but because of the way it sits in our collective intuition like a stone dropped into still water, ripples moving outward in patterns we don't yet understand, but recognize nonetheless. And this is not superstition or paranoia but something older. A kind of civilizational instinct that has always existed in human beings, when they sense that the ground beneath them is about to shift in ways that will redefine what it means to be alive, to belong, to believe. And perhaps this is why so many of us return, consciously or not, to the figure of Michel de Nostradamus, the physician and seer who wrote his visions not as pronouncements from on high, but as encoded warnings, symbolic maps of probability, drawn in the language of metaphor and shadow. And what disturbs us most about Nostradamus is not that he predicted the future, but that he seemed to understand something fundamental about time itself, that it does not move in a straight line but in spirals and echoes, that certain patterns repeat across centuries with only slight variations, and that human consciousness, when it reaches a certain threshold of tension, begins to generate events that feel inevitable, even though they are shaped entirely by our choices, our fears, our collective blindness. And so we return to his quatrains, not as believers in magic, but as people trying to decode what he saw in the architecture of human behavior, the way a psychologist might study recurring dreams, or a historian might recognize the prelude to collapse. And if we approach his work this way, not as literal prediction, but as symbolic diagnosis, then what he wrote about the years ahead, particularly about 2026, begins to feel less like fantasy, and more like a mirror held up to our present moment, reflecting back to us what we already know but have not yet admitted to ourselves. And this is where the unease begins, not in what he said, but in how accurately it seems to describe the world we are living in right now, the fractures we can all see but prefer not to name. Before we go further, there is something that needs to be said, not as a plea but as an acknowledgement of what this kind of exploration requires, which is a willingness to stay in the discomfort of not knowing, to resist the impulse to dismiss or to panic. And if you are someone who prefers looking ahead rather than away, who understands that awareness is not the same as fear, then consider becoming part of this conversation, by subscribing, by sharing this with others who might be ready for it, and by leaving a comment at the end with your name and your city, not as a gesture of agreement, but as a way of marking your presence in this moment, of saying that you were here when the threshold was still visible, before it was crossed. Nostradamus wrote in a time of plague, political upheaval, and religious war, which is to say, he wrote in a time not unlike our own. And his method was never to declare what would happen, but to describe what might happen if certain human tendencies were left unchecked, if certain thresholds were crossed without awareness. And this is why his quatrains are so frustratingly vague, so resistant to simple interpretation, because they were never meant to be instructions or warnings in the conventional sense, but rather invitations to look more deeply at the patterns we create, the cycles we repeat, the ways in which we remain unconscious even as we claim to be awake. And when we look at what he wrote about the mid-2020s, particularly about the year 2026, we find not a single clear event, but a constellation of images, a series of symbolic fragments that only make sense when we understand them as descriptions of a collective psychological and spiritual crisis, a moment when the structures that have held civilization together begin to reveal themselves as inadequate, not because they have failed technically, but because they no longer correspond to the level of consciousness humanity has reached, or perhaps needs to reach. And this gap, this dissonance between the world as it is and the world as it needs to become, is what creates the sense of approaching rupture, the feeling that something fundamental is about to change, whether we are ready for it or not. One of the visions that has drawn the most attention, though it is rarely interpreted with the nuance it deserves, involves what Nostradamus described in symbolic language as a great fire, that does not burn the body but consumes the spirit, a fire that spreads not through forests or cities but through the minds of men, leaving them hollow and confused, unable to distinguish between truth and illusion, between what is real and what is merely projected. And at first glance this seems like a straightforward warning about misinformation or propaganda. The kind of thing we hear about constantly in our age of social media and algorithmic manipulation. But the deeper you look at the language he used, the more it becomes clear that he was describing something far more profound than mere lies or deception. He was describing a crisis of meaning itself, A moment when the symbols and stories that have given human life coherence begin to fracture, when people can no longer agree on what is true, not because they lack information, but because the very frameworks through which truth is perceived have become incompatible. And this is not a technological problem but a spiritual one, a sign that the collective consciousness is undergoing a kind of disintegration that precedes either collapse or transformation. And when we look at the present moment, at the way political discourse has become untethered from shared reality, at the way communities fragment into mutually incomprehensible belief systems, at the way even basic facts become battlegrounds, we see exactly what he was describing. A fire that consumes not flesh, but identity. Not bodies, but the sense of coherent selfhood. And the question is not whether this is happening, but how much further it will go before something breaks or something new emerges. And this is where 2026 becomes significant. Not as the moment when this fire begins, but as the moment when it reaches a kind of critical mass, when the disintegration becomes so pervasive that it can no longer be ignored or managed, when individuals and institutions alike are forced to choose between clinging to the old frameworks even as they collapse, or stepping into the unknown territory of a consciousness that has not yet fully formed. And this choice, this threshold, is what makes the prophecy so unsettling, because it means that the crisis is not something that happens to us, but something that we must move through, something that requires not just survival but a fundamental shift in how we understand ourselves and our place in the world. Another image that surfaces in his writings, though it is often mistranslated or misunderstood, involves what he called the falling of the great pillars, a phrase that has been interpreted in countless ways over the centuries, sometimes as the collapse of empires, sometimes as the destruction of religious institutions, sometimes as the failure of economic systems. But when you read it in context, surrounded by references to silence and forgetting, to the loss of elders and the confusion of the young, it becomes clear that he was describing something more intimate and more devastating than the fall of any single institution. He was describing the collapse of generational continuity, the breaking of the thread that connects past to future, the moment when the accumulated wisdom of centuries becomes inaccessible, not because it is lost physically, but because the language and symbols through which it was transmitted no longer make sense to the people who need it most. And this is a peculiarly modern catastrophe, this sense that we are living in a time when the advice of the past seems irrelevant, when the elders no longer have answers because the world has changed too quickly, when the young feel abandoned, not because they lack parents or teachers, but because the frameworks those parents and teachers offer feel inadequate to the challenges of the present. And what makes this prophecy particularly relevant to 2026 is the way it intersects with demographic and cultural shifts that are accelerating globally, the aging of populations in some regions and the explosion of youth in others, the breakdown of traditional family structures, the rise of digital natives who have grown up in a fundamentally different reality than any previous generation, the sense that something essential about how humans pass on knowledge and meaning from one generation to the next has been interrupted, and this interruption is not neutral. It creates a kind of collective amnesia, a forgetting of not just history, but of the psychological and spiritual technologies that allowed previous generations to navigate crisis, to find meaning in suffering, to construct coherent identities in the face of chaos. And, without those technologies, without that continuity, people become unmoored in ways that are difficult to articulate but easy to feel. And the result is not just political or social fragmentation but a deeper kind of existential disorientation. A sense that we are living in a time without anchor points, without reliable guides. And this too reaches a kind of threshold in 2026. Not because that year marks the completion of the collapse, but because it marks the point at which the collapse becomes undeniable, the point at which we can no longer pretend that the old ways of transmitting meaning are still working, the point at which we must either find new ways or accept that we are living in a fundamentally rootless time. And the psychological impact of this realization, when it hits not just individuals but entire societies, is difficult to overstate, because it means confronting the possibility that we are more alone than we thought, more responsible for creating meaning than we imagined, more dependent on our own resources than we have been in centuries. There is a third thread in Nostradamus' writings that is even more difficult to discuss, partly because it touches on themes that are uncomfortable in an age that prides itself on rationality and skepticism, and partly because it seems to predict not an external event, but an internal shift, a change in the way human consciousness itself operates. And the language he uses is cryptic even by his standards, involving references to veils being torn, to skies opening, to people seeing what was always there but never visible. And for centuries this has been interpreted as either religious rapture or mass delusion. But when you place it alongside contemporary research into collective psychology, into the way belief systems shape perception, into the phenomenon of paradigm shifts and the sudden collapse of consensus reality. It begins to look less like mysticism and more like an accurate description of what happens when a civilization's foundational myths lose their power all at once, when the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and why we are here suddenly ring hollow. And what replaces those stories is not necessarily something better or worse, but something unprecedented, something that requires a different kind of consciousness to navigate. And this is where the prophecy becomes genuinely disturbing, because it suggests that 2026 may mark not just a social or political crisis, but a crisis of perception itself, a moment when large numbers of people begin to see reality in ways that are incompatible with the consensus view, not because they are delusional, but because the consensus view has become too narrow to accommodate what is actually happening, and this could manifest in countless ways. From sudden surges in reported mystical experiences to widespread rejection of materialist assumptions, to the emergence of new forms of community organized around entirely different principles than those that currently dominate. And the unsettling part is not that this shift might happen, but that we have no framework for understanding it when it does. We have no vocabulary for discussing collective consciousness changes that are neither pathological nor supernatural but simply different. And so we will likely interpret what is happening through the only lenses we have available, either dismissing it as mass hysteria or elevating it as proof of some specific belief system, when in reality, it may be neither. It may simply be the natural evolution of human consciousness reaching a point where the old categories no longer apply. And the reason this is predicted for 2026, rather than some other year, is not arbitrary. It connects to cycles that Nostradamus tracked throughout his work. Cycles of tension and release, of compression and expansion, of collective unconsciousness giving way to collective awareness. And these cycles, when they reach their peak, do not produce gradual change, but sudden shifts. Moments when everything that was building beneath the surface erupts into visibility all at once. And whether we are ready for that eruption, whether we have the psychological and spiritual tools to navigate it without fragmenting completely, is one of the great open questions of our time. A fourth pattern emerges when you trace the references to water and drought across his quatrains. Images of seas rising and wells running dry, of populations moving and borders dissolving, of conflicts over resources that are framed not as wars, but as necessities. And this is where his prophecies intersect most directly with contemporary concerns about climate change, resource scarcity, and environmental collapse. But what is striking about his treatment of these themes is that he never presents them as purely physical problems. He always links them to psychological and spiritual dimensions, suggesting that the external crisis of resources is inseparable from an internal crisis of value, that the way we relate to the natural world reflects and amplifies the way we relate to ourselves and each other. And when he points toward 2026 inches, this context, he seems to be indicating a moment when the environmental crisis stops being something we can conceptualize as future or distant and becomes viscerally, undeniably present, not necessarily through a single catastrophic event, but through an accumulation of smaller disruptions that collectively cross a threshold of tolerability. When the systems that buffer us from ecological reality begin to fail, not dramatically but gradually, when food security becomes uncertain, when migration pressures become overwhelming, when the gap between those who are protected from environmental consequences and those who are exposed becomes morally unsustainable. And what makes this prophecy particularly challenging is that it is not about a specific disaster we can prepare for or prevent, but about a fundamental shift in the baseline conditions of human life. A shift that will require not just technical solutions but profound changes in how we organize ourselves, how we distribute resources, how we understand prosperity and security, and the psychological impact of this shift. When it becomes clear that the abundance and stability we have taken for granted are not permanent features of reality but temporary conditions dependent on systems that are now breaking down, will be enormous. Because it will force us to confront questions about fairness, sacrifice, responsibility, and community that we have been avoiding for decades. And these are not abstract philosophical questions but deeply personal ones that will affect every aspect of how we live. And the reason 2026 emerges as significant in this pattern is that it represents a kind of tipping point. Not the moment when environmental change begins, but the moment when it becomes psychologically and socially impossible to pretend that we can continue as we have been. The moment when the cognitive dissonance between our lifestyles and their consequences becomes unbearable, and how we respond to that unbearability, whether with denial and violence or with adaptation and creativity, will determine not just the future of civilization, but the future of what it means to be human. The fifth, and perhaps most enigmatic thread, involves what Nostradamus described, in language that has been translated variously, as the return of the hidden, the emergence of the forgotten, or the awakening of what was buried. And this has spawned countless interpretations, from the literal return of suppressed knowledge to the metaphorical resurgence of archetypal forces. But when you read it carefully, in context with the other prophecies, it becomes clear that he was describing a process by which aspects of human experience that have been marginalized or denied by the dominant culture begin to reassert themselves with undeniable force, and this could include indigenous wisdom traditions, feminine principles of leadership and organization, non-rational ways of knowing, modes of community and economy that predate industrial capitalism, spiritual practices that connect people directly to meaning without institutional mediation, all the things that modernity has dismissed as primitive or irrelevant, but which contain precisely the tools and perspectives that are needed to navigate the crisis modernity has created. And the prophecy suggests that 2026 marks a moment when these hidden or forgotten elements can no longer be suppressed, when they burst through the surface of acceptable discourse and begin to reshape how people organize their lives. And this is not necessarily a comfortable or harmonious process, because the resurgence of what was buried often involves confronting why it was buried in the first place, confronting the violence and trauma that was required to suppress it, confronting the ways in which our current identities and institutions are built on foundations of exclusion and denial, and this confrontation is both personal and collective. It requires individuals to examine their own participation in systems of oppression, and societies to reckon with histories they would prefer to forget. And the reason this becomes unavoidable in 2026, according to the symbolic timeline Nostradamus laid out, is that the crises described in the other prophecies create conditions in which the old strategies for managing reality no longer work, in which people are forced to look beyond the approved narratives and sanction methods for survival and meaning, in which the alternatives that were always there, but always dismissed, suddenly become not just valid, but necessary. And this shift, when it happens, is irreversible. Because once people have seen that other ways of living and knowing are possible, once they have experienced the inadequacy of the dominant frameworks, they cannot unsee it. They cannot go back to believing that the way things are is the only way things could be. And this awakening, this return of the hidden, is simultaneously the most hopeful and most threatening of all the prophecies, because it opens up possibilities for transformation that are genuinely new, while also challenging every structure of power and meaning that currently exists. What becomes clear when you step back and look at these 5 threads together is that they are not separate predictions but aspects of a single process, a process that Nostradamus understood was built into the architecture of history itself. The way a seed contains the pattern of the tree it will become, and that process involves the dissolution of old forms and the emergence of new ones, the breaking down of structures that have outlived their usefulness, and the building up of structures that correspond to a new level of consciousness. And 2026 appears in his work not as a date chosen arbitrarily, but as a symbolic marker, a point in the historical spiral where multiple cycles converge, where the tension that has been building across multiple domains reaches a kind of simultaneity. And what makes this convergence so significant is that it creates conditions for rapid, non-linear change, the kind of change that does not follow predictable patterns, but erupts in ways that surprise everyone, including those who thought they were prepared. And this is why prophecy is always somewhat enigmatic, because it describes potentials rather than certainties, probabilities shaped by the collective consciousness of humanity rather than fixed outcomes written in stone. And the reason Nostradamus wrote in symbols rather than plain language is not to obscure his meaning but to preserve it, because symbolic language can carry truths that change their specific manifestation, depending on the context, while remaining essentially accurate, whereas literal predictions would have been either obviously wrong or too specific to be useful. And so what he left us is not a map of the future, but a diagnostic tool, a way of recognizing patterns when they emerge. And when we use that tool to examine our present moment, what we see is not comforting. We see all 5 threads converging. We see the crisis of meaning and truth, the collapse of generational continuity, the shift in consciousness and perception, the environmental threshold, the return of suppressed knowledge and ways of being, all happening simultaneously, all reinforcing each other, all building toward 2026, not as an end, but as a transition point, a threshold beyond which the world operates according to different rules, and whether we cross that threshold consciously or unconsciously, with awareness or in denial, with creativity or with violence, is still to be determined. This is where the concept of prophecy itself needs to be understood more carefully, because if we treat these visions as fixed predictions of an unchangeable future, then we misunderstand both Nostradamus and the nature of time. The prophecies are not descriptions of what will happen, but descriptions of what is likely to happen if current trajectories continue unchanged, and this means they contain within themselves the possibility of their own transformation, because to see a pattern clearly is to gain the power to alter it. To become conscious of a trajectory is to create the possibility of choosing a different path. And this is why Nostradamus wrote his quatrains in the first place, not to doom humanity to a predetermined fate, but to offer a chance at conscious navigation. To say, here are the patterns I see, here is where they are leading, here is what happens if you do not change course. And now that you know, you can choose differently, and this choice is not dramatic or heroic in the conventional sense. It does not involve grand gestures or revolutionary upheaval. It involves something more subtle and more difficult. It involves the willingness to change oneself before trying to change the world, to examine one's own participation in the patterns that are causing harm, to cultivate inner stability and clarity so that when the external structures begin to shake, there is something solid to stand on, and this is the true preparation for 2026. Not stockpiling resources or building bunkers or placing bets on which scenario will unfold, but developing the psychological, emotional, and spiritual capacity to remain conscious and compassionate in the midst of chaos, to hold complexity without collapsing into simplistic explanations, to act with integrity even when the incentives push towards selfishness, to maintain connection with others even when the pressures pull toward isolation. And this kind of preparation is not something that happens overnight. It requires sustained practice, daily choices, a commitment to growth that is independent of whether the prophecies come true or not. Because the value of becoming more conscious, more stable, more capable of love and clear thinking, is not contingent on external events. It is intrinsically valuable regardless of what the future brings. So how do we prepare for a threshold we cannot fully see? How do we ready ourselves for a transformation whose specific contours remain uncertain? And the answer is that we prepare by becoming more fully ourselves, by shedding the false identities and borrowed beliefs that have kept us comfortable but unconscious, by doing the inner work that allows us to respond to reality as it actually is rather than as we wish it would be. And this means different things for different people. For some it means reconnecting with practices that ground them in their bodies, in the present moment, in the natural world. For others it means deepening their intellectual understanding of the systems they are part of, studying history and psychology and ecology, so that they can recognize patterns and anticipate consequences. For others still, it means repairing relationships, building community, creating networks of mutual support that can withstand disruption. And for many, it means some combination of all of these. A holistic approach to growth that recognizes that we are not just minds, or just bodies, or just social beings, but all of these at once, and that preparing for transformation requires attention to every dimension of our humanity. And what is crucial to understand is that this preparation is not about eliminating fear or attaining some perfect state of enlightenment. It is about developing the capacity to be with whatever arises, to stay present and engaged, even when things are difficult or uncertain, to trust in one's own resourcefulness and the fundamental goodness of life, even when the surface appearance suggests otherwise. And this trust is not naive optimism, but something earned through experience. Through having faced challenges before and discovered that you have more strength and resilience than you knew. Through having seen that, even in the darkest times, there are always people reaching out to help each other, always moments of beauty and connection, always the possibility of beginning again. And it is this accumulated wisdom, this deep knowing that life continues, and humans adapt and meaning can be found even in the midst of collapse, that becomes the most valuable resource when facing a threshold like 2026. What Nostradamus seems to have understood, and what we are only beginning to grasp, is that historical transitions of this magnitude are not primarily about external events, but about internal shifts. They are moments when the collective consciousness of humanity reaches a point where it can no longer sustain the contradictions it has been living with, where the gap between how we see ourselves and how we actually behave becomes unbearable, where the systems we have built reveal themselves to be incompatible with our deepest values. And at these moments, change becomes not just necessary but inevitable, and the only question is whether that change will be conscious or unconscious, creative or destructive. And this is why becoming aware of the prophecies, of the patterns that are pointing toward 2026, is itself an act of power. Because awareness creates options. It allows us to participate in shaping what happens, rather than simply being shaped by it. And this participation does not require special knowledge or extraordinary abilities. It requires only the willingness to look honestly at reality, to accept responsibility for one's own small part in the larger whole, and to make choices that align with the world we want to create rather than the world we are trying to escape. And these choices are available to everyone, every day, in every interaction, in how we speak to each other, in how we spend our time and money, in what we pay attention to and what we ignore, in whether we react with fear or respond with wisdom. And collectively, millions of these small choices add up to something enormous. They shift the field of probability. They alter the trajectory of the whole system. And this is why individual consciousness and collective transformation are not separate processes but aspects of the same movement, and why the work we do on ourselves is never just personal but always political and spiritual and evolutionary. As we approach 2026, there is a choice that each of us will face, consciously or unconsciously, and that choice is between remaining attached to the world that is passing away or turning toward the world that is struggling to be born. And this is not a comfortable choice because it means letting go of certainties, releasing identities that have served us but are no longer adequate, accepting that we do not and cannot know exactly what comes next, and there is grief in this letting go. Real grief for the loss of the familiar, for the end of an era, for the recognition that things we took for granted are not coming back. And it is important to honor that grief, to give it space, to allow ourselves to mourn what is being lost even as we turn toward what is emerging. Because the attempt to bypass grief, to jump straight to acceptance or hope without passing through the pain of loss, only delays the healing and makes us more brittle, more likely to cling to the past or project unrealistic fantasies onto the future. Whereas, when we allow ourselves to fully feel the grief, to sit with the discomfort and the uncertainty, something shifts. We become more present, more resilient, more capable of meeting reality on its own terms. And this emotional maturity, this capacity to hold both grief and hope, both loss and possibility, is perhaps the most essential preparation of all, because it allows us to navigate change without becoming overwhelmed by it, to witness the collapse of old forms without concluding that all is lost, and to participate in the birth of new forms without demanding that they look like what we expected. Returning now to where we began, to that sense of intuition about 2026, that feeling that something is approaching. We can see it differently. Not as a premonition of doom, but as a recognition of readiness, a sign that we have reached a point in our collective development where we are capable of seeing what is coming and choosing how to meet it. And this is actually a kind of maturity, a coming of age for the human species, because for most of history we have been reactive, responding to crises as they arise without understanding the larger patterns. But now we have developed the tools, the consciousness, the global communication networks that allow us to see patterns forming before they fully manifest, to anticipate thresholds before we cross them. And this gives us a chance, however slim, to influence the nature of the transition, to steer toward outcomes that minimize harm and maximize the possibility for flourishing. And whether we seize that chance or squander it is still unfolding, still being determined by the choices we make now, in these years leading up to 2026, in the conversations we have, the priorities we set, the values we embody. And this is where each individual becomes significant, not because any one person can change the trajectory of history alone, but because the trajectory is made up of millions of individual choices, and each choice either reinforces the old pattern or contributes to a new one. And when enough people begin making choices from a place of consciousness, rather than conditioning, from wisdom rather than fear, from connection rather than separation, the whole field begins to shift, and what seemed impossible becomes imaginable, and what seemed inevitable becomes optional. And this is the real power of prophecy. Not that it tells us what will happen, but that it shows us what could happen, and in showing us, gives us the chance to choose differently. If you have read this far, if you have stayed with this inquiry into what 2026 might mean, then you are already part of the shift, already participating in the awakening that the prophecies describe, because the willingness to look at difficult truths, to sit with uncertainty, to consider possibilities that challenge your current understanding, these are the qualities that will be most needed in the years ahead. And by cultivating them now, you are preparing not just yourself, but the collective field, contributing to the reservoir of consciousness and resilience that humanity will draw on when the threshold is crossed. And so the invitation now is to continue this preparation, to deepen it, to share it with others, not by preaching or convincing but by embodying it, by being someone who remains calm and clear when others are panicking, who asks good questions when others are offering easy answers, who builds connection when others are retreating into isolation. And to mark your participation in this moment, by leaving a comment below, with your name and your city. Not as a trivial gesture, but as a way of saying, I am here. I am aware. I am choosing to meet what is coming with consciousness rather than denial. And by sharing this message with others who might be ready to hear it, not to alarm them, but to invite them into the same process of awakening. Because the more people who approach 2026 with awareness and inner stability, the more likely we are to navigate it without catastrophic harm. And the more likely we are to discover that what seemed like an ending was actually a beginning, that what felt like collapse was actually transformation, and that what we feared was destruction was actually the birth of something we do not yet have words for, but which we will recognize when we see it. Because it will feel like coming home, like finally being able to be fully human, fully alive, fully connected to ourselves and each other and the living world. And this, ultimately, is what the prophecies have always been pointing toward. Not a future of doom, but a future of possibility. Not the end of humanity, but its next beginning. And whether we reach that beginning is still, even now, up to us.